We will now concentrate on solving quadratic equations by using the quadratic formula. First, though, we need to recall the steps for solving a quadratic equation by completing the square. So we will use this in order to solve for the general form of the quadratic equation, which is a times x squared plus b times x plus c set equal to 0, where a, b, and c are real numbers, but remember a cannot be equal to 0, because if a is equal to 0, then the squared term is no longer part of the equation and it is no longer quadratic, but now it is actually linear. So the next thing that we're going to look at is we're going to follow our steps. So steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 for solving this quadratic equation 4x with the process of completing the square. So our first step is to divide sides by a in order to make the leading coefficient equal to 1. So we're going to divide through by a, and that means we're going to divide everything by a. So we're going to have a times x squared divided by a plus b times x divided by a plus c divided by a, and then we need to keep our equation balanced, so that will also be 0 divided by a. And we want to clean this up in 3 ways. First, we want to notice that the a's can simplify, and that's the whole point of this. So now we have x squared, so notice our coefficient of x squared is 1. The next thing we want to do is we want to be able to identify the coefficient of x, so therefore we want to write that distinctly. So b over a times x. There's nothing we can do with c over a right now. And then 0 divided by anything that is not 0, and remember a cannot be 0. 0 divided by a will give us 0. Our next step is critical. We need to be able to complete the square, so that means we need to have the constant on the right-hand side. So we're going to, I'm going to just change my pen ink so we make sure we understand. Next step, we're going to subtract c over a, and I'm actually going to leave some room right here, and that's so that we can complete the square. So when we subtract c over a from 0, we get negative c over a. So now we want to identify the coefficient of our first degree term, which is x, and so our coefficient is actually b divided by a. And remember, the process of completing the square is to take 1/2 of the coefficient of your first degree term, and 1 times b is b, and 2 times a is 2a. And then following our steps, we're going to square this. Remember, this is the process of completing the square. And remember, to square a fraction, we want to square everything within that fraction. So we're going to square b. We're going to square 2, which gives us 4. And we're going to square a, which gives us a squared. And this is what we're going to add to both sides. So that gives us a plus b squared over a, 4a squared, added to both sides. Now remember, the whole point of doing this on the left-hand side is to then get a perfect square trinomial. And a perfect square trinomial is a quantity squared. So we need x, and then notice everything's addition. And then the last part of this comes from the work that we did on the side. So if we look at this right here, we're trying to create a quantity squared. So that means we actually have to split this in half. So this is where our b over 2a goes. And notice if we were to redistribute b over 2a times b over 2a, that is what gives us our b squared over 4a squared. So now this is our perfect square trinomial, and anything times itself is the base squared. So now we're ready to proceed on the right-hand side. So on the right-hand side, we need to recognize we have two fractions, and we need to get a common denominator. So notice, please, that they do have an a in common, but what they don't have in common is that 4, and then the second factor of a. So that's what we're going to have to introduce to this negative c, is we need to multiply it by what is missing, which was the 4 and the other factor of a. B squared is all set, no changes there. So now that we have a common denominator, we can now write this. Oops. As all being over 4a squared, and negative c times 4a is negative 4ac, and now we have plus b squared. And our next step is, remember, we're trying to solve for x, and so we need to free up x by undoing the square power, and the inverse operation of square power is square root. So we're going to take the square root of the left side, which will then give us just x plus b divided by 2a. And then remember, every quadratic equation has two solutions. And so this is equal to the positive or the negative of the square root of negative 4ac plus b squared, all divided by 4 times a squared. And I'm going to make sure that I draw my square root a little bit better. I want to make sure it's housed all over that fraction. So we're going to actually do 2 steps in the next one, and that is to recognize, again, my job is to solve for x. And so for this equation, in order to solve for x, I need to subtract b over 2a. And then notice now it is plus or minus. And then a square root of a fraction is the square root of the numerator divided by the square root of the denominator. And that's using our quotient rule. So now if you noticed, we have a denominator of 4, which is a perfect square, and a squared is also a perfect square. And the square root of 4a squared becomes 2a. So finishing this up, we're going to do 2 things. We're going to recognize that I now have a common denominator of 2a. And then for the first fraction, we have negative b. And then for the second fraction, connected by addition and subtraction, we have the square root of. And then a little bit of an awkward note here. It's just not usually mathematically proper, let's say, to begin an expression with a negative. But we can actually use our commutativity property and write this as b squared minus 4ac. And many of you might recognize this as the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula can be used to solve any quadratic equation. So that's exactly what we're going to now practice with. And so the quadratic formula for a quadratic equation of the form a times x squared plus bx plus c set equal to 0, where a cannot be 0, the solutions of this equation are x set equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. All right, so the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to solve this quadratic equation by using the formula. And we can see the formula right up above. And the first thing that I'd encourage you always to do is to state what a is, which is the coefficient of our squared term, which is 2. B is our negative 7, and C is negative 9. And then notice the most intense or involved part of your quadratic formula is the part that's under the radical, and that's going to become very important to us. That's a special part of our quadratic equation. We'll talk about that. Our quadratic formula, pardon me. We'll talk about that later on. So b squared, notice b is negative, so parentheses are important. We have negative 7 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 9. Lots of negatives, we need to be conscious of that. So that gives us 49, and then remember we have a subtraction, but that's going to be a product of a negative. And so we have plus, and 4 times 2 is 8, and 8 times 9 is 72. And so the piece that's underneath our radical is actually 121. And do you recognize that 121 is a perfect square? So now using our quadratic formula, we have x is equal to negative b. So that's the negative of negative 7 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac we found to be 121. And then all divided by 2 times a. And a is 2. Now, one of the things we want to be conscious of is the fact that with completing the square, a has to be 1. But with the quadratic formula, a can be anything except for 0. So a negative of a negative is a positive. So we have positive 7 plus or minus, and remember 11 squared gives us 121. Therefore, the square root of 121 is 11. And then this is all divided by 4. And then remember, your language is often very important, and you need to hear yourself. When you say this, we have 7 plus or minus 11, so we need to separate. So it's 7 plus 11 divided by 4, which is 18 divided by 4, which actually reduces to 9 over 2. So that is one of the solutions we found. The other one is found by letting 7 be subtracted by 11 and then divided by 4. So 7 minus 11 is negative 4, and negative 4 divided by 4 gives us our second solution, which is negative 11. So your first problem is to solve by using the quadratic formula. 3 times x squared minus 10 times x minus 8, and then set equal to 0. And I do encourage you to first determine what a is, b, c, and then find b squared minus 4ac and proceed. And the next example we're going to do together, I want you to notice we've got a little bit of work to do here. So if you're asked to solve by using the quadratic formula, the first thing we need to do is clean this up and get it in a times x squared plus b times x plus c. and then set equal to 0. So we need to distribute and then make sure that this is set equal to 0. So we have x squared plus 8x minus 3 set equal to 0. So this time a is 1, b is 8, and c is negative 3. And then finding b squared minus 4ac, we have 8 squared minus 4 times 1 and then times negative 3. And 8 squared is 64. And then we have minus negative 12, which actually becomes plus 12, which gives us a total of 76. And I'd like you to notice that this is not a perfect square, nor is it prime though. But if we try to find the factors of 76 besides 1 and 76, so if we take 76 and we divide it by 2, we get 38. We divide that by 2, we get 19. And so that means 76 is actually 4 times 19. And so even though 76 is not a perfect square, it contains a perfect square. So that will have implications for when we go to solve for x and simplify. So solving for x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of, well, b squared minus 4ac we found to be 76. And then this is all divided by 2 times 1. And so you need to remember that 76 is actually 4 times 19. And the square root of 4 is 2. And then the square root of 19, there's nothing more we can do there. And then finally, what I would like you to notice with this problem is 8, 2, and 2 are all even. So negative 8 divided by 2 becomes negative 4. Positive 2 divided by 2 becomes 1. And so we have plus or minus 1 square root of 19. So that is simplified. Man, you want to always push yourself to do that. And question number 2, you are asked to solve by using the quadratic formula for x times the quantity of x plus 9 equals negative 4. And make sure your answer is simplified.